This podcast was recorded a few hours before the terrible explosion in Beirut. The scale of the humanitarian crisis is staggering. The explosion has laid bare the scale of the dysfunction of the Lebanese state. At best, this series of events can be described as a criminal level of negligence. But there are many other, far less charitable ways to describe events. Lebanon today may look like a failed state. But like most Lebanese citizens, whether in the country or living abroad, we need to focus on practical solutions to help the country recover. There's no shortage of ideas to revive the economy, but I often pause at many of the very well thought out, very well intentioned proposals. The problem is that I see they're trying to solve every problem at the same time. That's more ambitious than I believe is realistic. It's quixotic. Lebanon needs to start with a single positive shock that will catalyze the reforms that need to be addressed. Now, there's a long list of problems that need to be solved urgently, but foremost among them is the accelerating inflation and corruption. This is precisely why I support the establishment of a currency board in Lebanon. It stabilizes the currency, but much more importantly, it puts politicians in a fiscal straitjacket. The government will no longer be able to borrow from a central bank. The fiscal discipline on the entire political establishment for the future is going to be a critical tool in not just maintaining fiscal discipline, but also in containing corruption. So in the spirit of putting forward ideas to help restore some stability to Lebanon, what follows is my discussion with Steve Hanke. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us, Steve. And we last discussed Lebanon 2 months ago. At that time, we were discussing your reaction to the government's economic program, which you argued would fail because it does not include a mechanism to restore confidence by fixing the currency through a currency board. What's happened since then, of course, is worse than we really imagined. The government's economic plan, which envisaged presenting and passing a medium-term fiscal strategy by June 30th has not materialized. We're now in August. Negotiations with the IMF stalled. Some members of Lebanon's negotiating team resigned. The foreign minister resigned. The economy is in free fall, and you're estimating that Lebanon is the first MENA country to experience hyperinflation. Now, there is some support for a currency board, as you proposed. We saw one very prominent independent member of parliament, Paula Yakubian, support the idea. We also saw some criticism. So I thought maybe we will step back and hear your views after you've been interacting with a lot of people in Lebanon and talking to various people, and to hear your impressions regarding how your ideas were received and your thoughts regarding some of the pushback that you've heard. So let me start with the question of inflation. You're estimating inflation to be running over 400%. Of course, the official CPI number is very different. Some goods are effectively subsidized. Others are priced at based on the official exchange rate, which is really not an exchange rate which most people can access. Can you help us interpret your estimate of inflation? What is the economic rationale behind your calculation? And what does it mean for the average person? And more importantly, what does it mean for policy? How would economic policy need to be reacting to these inflationary pressures?
Okay, Osama, it's good to be with you again. And the inflation picture, let me just summarize it by saying, as of today, the inflation rate is actually 413.65% per year. So you're right, it is remaining over 400%. Lebanon has gone into hyperinflation. Now, I keep the Routledge world inflation table up to date. I first actually presented that in the Routledge Handbook of Major Economic events in history. I wrote that initial piece with one of my assistants at the time, and we had 56 hyperinflations, and each one of those 56 we went through. It took us 2 years to do the table, with Nick Cruz working full-time for 2 years on it, because I refused to include anything in the table unless I could get the original data and I could replicate it and get the number. So it took a tremendous amount of work. It was much more difficult than I ever dreamed of. But there in fact have been, at that point, there were 56. Now, with Lebanon coming into the picture, we're up to 62. Lebanon is officially in the table, so you can debate all you want whether they're hyperinflating or not. They are hyperinflating, and they're officially in the table because I'm the official keeper.
And the exact definition of hyperinflation.
Okay, the exact definition.
Part of this database. Yeah.
The exact definition is the original one that has started being used in the profession was proposed by Professor Philip Kagan, the late Professor Philip Kagan from Columbia University, and it was 50% per month. Now, he was just measuring monthly inflation with data once a month at the end of the month. Since then, and this gets into my method and your question, I am able to use high frequency data, and what that means is I literally can use hourly data if I want to calculate an hourly rate of inflation, a monthly rate of inflation, a daily rate of inflation, an annual rate of inflation. And so with the use of high frequency data, I can measure the monthly inflation rate every day. So I've altered the definition of hyperinflation slightly. It's more improved now and more precise. 50% per month has to be exceeded, and that has to exist for 30 consecutive days. Okay. So we have a full month of every single day, one after one after one, coming in at 50% or more per month. And that did occur in Lebanon, so they're in now. What's the theory or idea behind what I'm doing? Why can I use this high frequency data? Well, the first time it was ever used was in 2007, 2008 hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. I was the only one to measure it. It was the second highest hyperinflation in world history. Hungary still remains the top one. But in November of 2008, we had the second highest hyperinflation rate in world history in Zimbabwe. The prices were doubling every 24 hours in Zimbabwe. So here's the theory. The theory, we can go back to writings in the 16th century, and they, in fact, were writing about something that eventually became what's called purchasing power parity theory. And purchasing power parity theory really came into its own with Gustav Cassel, the very famous Swedish economist. He wrote an article in the Economic Journal in 1916 in which he called this purchasing power parity theory, he dubbed this theory of exchange rates purchasing power parity theory. And what it is, I'm simplifying tremendously because there are variations on this, yeah, and a lot of detail and so forth. But just for your general audience, purchasing power parity theory is a theory for determining exchange rates. In other words, you're trying to figure out where the exchange rates are going to go, or where they should be. And to do that, you look with purchasing power parity theory, you look at changes in the relative prices in two countries, and then you look at the exchange rate between their two currencies. And by looking at changes in relative prices and inflation rates between the two countries, you can predict in the intermediate term where the exchange rate should go. Now, that is a very orthodox theory. There are thousands and thousands of papers on this, seeing if it's right or not. It's used by the economist. You know, the hamburger index is based on purchasing power parity.
Indeed.
Because they look at the relative price of a hamburger, a Big Mac, in Lebanon and London, and then from that make some determination about where the exchange rate should be if purchasing power parity actually would hold. And it usually does in kind of the intermediate run. In the very short run, there are deviations, so it doesn't hold. So what I did in Zimbabwe, it's amazing. This theory, you see, has been around and in stone by all the heavyweight economists. Everyone uses purchasing power parity. I'm certain when you did your PhD at Johns Hopkins and under the tutelage of the famous Professor Bela Balassa, you learned all about purchasing power parity theory.
Yeah, so, I remember those days.
So at any rate, what I did, sometimes simple little things actually are very significant. And what I did, I said, no, I said, I want to turn all the equations around and use purchasing power parity, but I don't want to start with changes in relative prices to predict what would happen to the exchange rate or what the exchange rate should be ideally to make purchasing power parity hold. I want to reverse the thing. I want to start with changes in the free market exchange rates, be they in a real free market or on a black market. Look at those changes in the exchange rate, and then from that derive an implied inflation rate. And so I did it. You go through all the arithmetic and you can reverse all the equations and everything. And sure enough, you get the right answer in theory. But the question is, does this work in practice? So then I went back in all these hyperinflating countries, and you find that it works perfectly. With high inflations, with inflations that are over about 25% per year, it works like a charm. I can predict exactly with precision what the inflation rate is using purchasing power parity, and the only inputs that I need are the exchange rate and the inflation level in the, let's say it's the pound dollar. I would need to know what the inflation rate was in the U.S. to make the thing work. And so there's a very solid theory behind it. And after going over all these hyperinflations, it just works perfectly. If you look at the German hyperinflation, for example, in 1923, famous hyperinflation, the Germans, of course, kept very accurate records. They weren't keeping price records like they do in Lebanon or any place else. I mean, they were down to the 2 or 3 decimal points. So I look at those old price records that they were keeping, and then I look at the exchange rate and either the mark to sterling or the mark to gold, and use purchasing power parity theory to figure out what the implied inflation was. The implied inflation is just exactly what they were recording. It's like 99.9% accurate. The correlation is just perfect. So we have a huge difference between the official inflation rate in Lebanon and my accurate measure. My number, I can assure you, is the inflation rate. Now, you said, well, some things are subsidized, this, that, and the other thing. Also, you've got the COVID virus. They're probably not collecting the data in a timely way, so the official stuff's out of date. And a big thing, the basket of commodities they use is tiny compared to the actual number of goods that are purchased in Lebanon. each day or week or month. So their basket is small and it doesn't include everything. My number includes the prices of goods, the prices of services, the prices on the stock market, all asset prices, all service prices, all goods price, everything. It's a basket of everything.
This is a very important point. This is a very important point because a lot of people, when talking about inflation, think about specifically a CPI number, but the CPI is just a measure of a basket of goods. But when we're talking about inflation, indeed, the services price inflation is one thing. Producers face a different basket. The basket of goods purchased by different people at different income brackets also varies, right? So you can argue, right? So there are many ways to define inflation, and what you're talking about is an economy-wide measure, what is reflected by the black market exchange rate of the currency. That's
right. So we start with a black market exchange rate. You have to add a few things in, the inflation in the United States and so forth. But you can see, and I published many articles in peer-reviewed journals on this. It's shall we say, in the literature, as they say. And so you can go back and look at the equations are pretty simple, so you can actually figure out how to do it pretty easily. And most, even young students who were taking advanced economics courses could easily calculate the thing. So the basket is important. There is a way to do it. It's very accurate. It uses high frequency data and this very well established, very old theory of purchasing power parity. But the basket is different. My basket, or the one using purchasing power parity, has to be a basket that includes everything: goods, services, assets. Everything that moves in Lebanon is included, not just a specialized, narrow and tiny basket. So that's one thing. The other thing you mentioned, you said, well, some things, you have price controls and things are subsidized and so forth and so on. That gets to a second point beyond the basket, and that's something called repressed inflation. If you have price controls on something, let's say bread, for example, and I looked at this, by the way, in Syria, when Syria, the civil war started. I looked at this very carefully in Syria because I can, of course, determine the inflation rate in Syria. Today, by the way, in Syria, the inflation rate is 271.17%. In Lebanon, it's 413.65%. So inflation's a lot higher in Lebanon than Syria. But I looked at this repressed inflation, and so they had price controls on bread, and of course, if you have price controls on something, people want more of it than is available. So they had also restrictions on the amount of bread that you could purchase when you went into line to the bakery and bought your cheap bread with price controls. So what people would do is, and this is what always happens with price controls or subsidized things, they would buy as much bread as they were allowed to buy, and then they'd go outside the bakery and literally resell the bread they didn't want at a free market, black market price right outside the door of the bakery. So what do I pick up with the implied inflation? The number I get isn't the price control price of the bread. It's the price that the guy is paying outside the bakery door in the black market.
You're picking up your measure of inflation is one that would clear the market. There would be no shortages.
Right. It's called open inflation. It's a measure of open inflation, and the basket includes everything. That's technically what it is. Open. So I'm measuring the reality of what the open inflation is actually in Lebanon right now.
So, what does to transition maybe away from inflation, to the question of currency board, which was your proposal, which would, you had proposed it precisely as a way to prevent an inflationary spiral, as one of the reasons to have a currency board. Let's talk a bit about how it was received and what your thoughts are regarding some of the criticisms, I think, that you've heard, I've heard, and others. One criticism I heard often is that a currency board does not fix the crisis. It's possible to have a currency board, but what's more important is to have a fiscal and structural reform program. Now, it's hard to disagree with the view that Lebanon's economy is in shambles, will be in shambles, as long as there's no reform, right? But what is the sequencing issue here? Is macro stabilization a necessary precondition for putting a currency board in place? How would does it need to be part of a package, precede a package? What are your thoughts about that?
The crisis, the epicenter of the crisis in Lebanon, it is a currency crisis. There are other secondary and tertiary crises going on at the same time, but the ultimate source, the atomic bomb in the thing, is the currency. Lebanon has a currency crisis, so you have to go to the center of the inferno and put out the fire first. So that's you must do this first, and that a lot of the discussion that's come up around currency boards, for example, in Lebanon, that proposal, have essentially been besides the point, because people will say, oh no, what about the banking? You got to do the banking thing, or what about the electricity? I mean, we don't have electricity. Oh, what about the fires up in the mountains? I mean, we don't have enough money to fund the fire people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all big, huge problems, but there is one mega problem, and that is the currency. It must be fixed before you can eliminate hyperinflation, before you can stabilize the country, before any government or public authority could gain any credibility. They must get rid of hyperinflation and the currency crisis that exists. So the sequencing, in my mind, and I'm speaking from a great deal of experience, by the way, most of the people talking about this in Beirut are drinking too much Turkish coffee and talking too much, quite frankly. They have never studied these. They've never been involved. They have no experience whatsoever. And you know that right away when they start talking about, oh, the currency board, it's not going to solve the banking crisis. Yeah, I know it's not going to solve the banking crisis. It will mitigate the banking crisis problem, but the banking crisis is a separable issue that will be assisted by having a stable currency. If you don't have a stable currency, if you have a floating exchange rate, for example, the floating pound will not float on a sea of tranquility in Beirut. It will sink like a stone. This is exactly what happened in Jakarta in July of 1997 when the IMF advised Suharto to start floating the rupiah. It sunk like a stone, and inflation reared up. And what happened? You had food riots. And what happened eventually? Well, eventually that was the end of Suharto. So that's the sequencing thing. And let me give you one practical example. One that I was personally involved in 1989. The first time I met President Carlos Menem, who incidentally, as everyone knows, is family origin is Syrian. So in Latin America, he's a Turco, what's called a Turco. And I met Menem, and Menem, the reason that I met him, I'd been very involved in Chile and the economic reforms that the Chicago boys had been engaged in Chile. And Menem wanted to copy those liberal reforms, knock out corruption, get the red tape out of the economy, deregulate the economy, and make it more free market and less government intervention and all these things. So he wanted to do that, and he wanted a big privatization program, by the way, in Argentina. And when he was elected in 1989, one of the first things he did, he established a new ministry, a ministry of privatization. But when I met him, he wanted to know about the reforms in Chile and how those were done and what ideas that I had. And he complained bitterly that after I made my presentation, he said, I'm trying to do everything you're suggesting, Professor Hanke, but he says, nothing's working. He says, I can't do anything. He said, I can't privatize a piece of bread even. And I said, I know, and I know why. And he set up to attention. He says, why? And I said, you have triple-digit inflation roaring away in Argentina as we sit here today. And you were elected, but no one thinks you have any credibility. No one thinks you can do anything. No one trusts you to do anything. And the reason why is because you haven't done anything to kill inflation. So they say, what would Menem know? He can't kill our main problem. Our main problem is inflation. And we're going to let this guy start privatizing stuff? So he said, what would you do? And I said, I think I know what I would do. I probably would think about a currency board arrangement like they did in Hong Kong in 1983. But I said, I'll have to think about it a little bit. And he said, well, could you write that up, or write a short book on it? And I said, yeah. So Dr. Kurt Schuler and I did write that book. In a very short period of time, we proposed an orthodox currency board. They did put in what they called convertibility. It was not a currency board, by the way. Most people are confused by this. It had a fixed exchange rate with the U.S. dollar. It had a lot of foreign reserves backing up the peso. It traded at a 1-to-1 exchange rate. Free convertibility. No capital controls or exchange controls. And it killed inflation. It gave Menem immediate credibility, and then he went on with a lot of reforms. It eventually blew up, and by the way, I wrote an article in the fall, either September or October, Wall Street Journal, in which I said if they didn't make this convertibility system a currency board, an orthodox currency board, that the thing would eventually blow up. Well, it took 10 years. It did blow up. I was right. But in the meantime, they had a big run of a big boom in Argentina, no inflation, and so forth and so on. So that's an example of the sequencing. You see, Menem did not have the sequencing right. He wanted to fix everything else that was going wrong, but he failed to kill inflation, and he failed to have credibility, and that meant that the public opinion just wouldn't support him to do anything.
I often what I often hear from listening to a lot of people in Lebanon is a situation whereby I think that the perfect is becoming the enemy of the good, i.e. everyone is so, there is of course, as you said, the currency crisis, but there is behind that and the original sin is a government debt problem, right? Everyone is trying to create a program that addresses all the problems at the same time, but how do you get credibility in from to even begin? And this is where your proposal becomes very attractive, because you need something that people can start signing contracts denominated in a currency that people can trust will be valued a month hence, right?
Yes.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it is you start with the currency as an anchor for stabilizing not just inflationary expectations, but just everything else, and then you start building on. Now, of course, in the meantime, there are many issues here that are going to come into play, which is the next steps after a currency board, and also the technicalities of it. Now, another criticism I hear is that given the level of reserves in the country, the FX reserves of the central bank, and there are many ways in which the central bank has been accounting for reserves, and this is something that is being discussed. But given what could be available as FX reserves, will imply that an exchange rate that is so heavily depreciated that politically it is unpalatable. Now, we might get there anyway through hyperinflation, but what are your thoughts in terms of how to set up a currency board in the absence of a sufficient somehow level of reserves?
Okay, so a couple of things, Usama. The main thing, and I think this is probably one thing that confuses people in Lebanon, and that is Lebanon had a pegged exchange rate. It lasted for a long time. They kept putting band-aids on it, and et cetera, and at the end ended up in effectively kind of with this financial engineering kind of a Ponzi scheme to keep the thing pegged. Pegs always blow up, always, because the central bank authority has an exchange rate policy and a monetary policy with a peg. And those two policies, the exchange rate policy and the monetary policy, eventually always get into conflict, particularly if you're running a huge fiscal deficit. You had that implies a monetary policy that's relatively loose or looser than it should be, when on the other hand you're trying to keep the peg. A currency board is not a peg. You have a fixed exchange rate. You have an exchange rate policy. You have no monetary policy. There is no monetary policy. You are just exchanging anchor currency for the domestic currency at a fixed exchange rate with free convertibility. That's all. It's just an exchange house. So you have no monetary policy with a currency board. The other point I'd like to make before answering directly your question, and this is one thing that I really wish I was in Lebanon, because I would have everyone on my side, because everyone in Lebanon, I don't care what political color or stripe you are sick and tired of the corrupt politicians. And the currency board does what? It puts the politicians in a straitjacket. I don't know, I can't imagine anyone except the politicians or people who have their greedy hands out feeding at the political trough who would be against putting Lebanese politicians in straitjackets. It's just inconceivable. So this should be, the currency boards should be so massively popular right across the spectrum of everyone. Everyone should agree, because everyone should agree to a straitjacket. Now, let's assume everyone agrees with me that that's a good idea. Then the technical question comes up that you just asked, and that is, well, where are the reserves? The crooks stole all the money. We don't have any money. And that is where you get into the technicalities of setting the thing up. This is not a problem, by the way. Let me give you the extreme case. Let's say there are zero reserves at the central bank, or negative reserves, And let's say you want to set up a separate currency board, or you want to set up a currency board as a subdivision of the central bank. You leave the central bank and where it is. No, don't change the name, but you set up a new department called the issue department. This is what they did in Bulgaria. So the Bulgarian National Bank is still a central bank, but there's a chunk of it called the issue department, and that issues the currency. That is a currency board. That is governed by a currency board law. So the question is, well, how do you get the money to do that? Well, in Bulgaria, it was easy. They were hyperinflating. The real value of the monetary base was almost nothing, so you didn't really need many reserves. Now, remember, a currency board, you're talking about 100% reserves only for the monetary base. Only for the monetary base. So the monetary base in a country is much smaller than the total broad money measured with any kind of broad measure of money, M3, M4, whatever the number happens to be. So that's one thing. I have not done due diligence on this. So this is a lot of hand waving by Lebanese people saying we don't have any money, there are no reserves, we could never set one up. And they say it's not feasible because we don't have reserves. I don't know, because I haven't actually been in Beirut and examined everything, and I don't exactly know what the reserve level is. But let's assume that it's zero. What you do in that case, you have the government borrow or come up with some money if they have any reserves, but they can borrow the money, and they could borrow it from the IMF, and they put that money in as equity in the initial currency board that you're setting up. And once you do that, you have 100% reserves, and of course the government owns the equity. They own 100% of the currency board, so there's no problem there. It's very easy to do. They borrowed the money from the IMF. They put the equity in. That equity, by the way, will make a lot of money because the confidence will come immediately. This has been the case every single currency board. They've been set up in the middle of civil wars. Keynes set one up in North Russia in the Russian Civil War. The demand for the golden ruble at the currency board skyrocketed. The gold reserve skyrocketed, and of course, the currency board makes a profit, and that's why I like it relative to full dollarization. See, one option that would technically be really the same for Lebanon, you just get rid of the pound, forget the pound, and you just dollarize the country. Now the problem with that, or the only disadvantage, there are no problems with it. By the way, it's a very good solution. I was involved in dollarizing Montenegro in 1999, and in 2000, I was advisor to the finance minister in Ecuador, and Ecuador dollarized, got rid of their local currency. So the problem that you solve with a currency board, you make a profit because you're issuing a liability, the Lebanese pound, that carries no interest. Your liabilities carry no interest. They're very cheap to produce, the bills and coins. And you have assets 100% backing up the liabilities, the money that you're issuing, the base money, the high-powered money that you're issuing at the currency board. And that spread between return on assets and zero interest on liabilities is a profit. Now the question still becomes another technical question. Well, what's the exchange rate going to be? Because wherever you set the exchange rate will determine how many reserves you actually need. And to do that, the best approach is the one I've always recommended, which we actually did in Bulgaria in 1997. You freeze the current monetary base at its current level, You let the exchange rate float freely without any constraints for 30 days. You observe what's happened in that 30-day period. You do some bench calculations too, and you decide what the exchange rate is going to be. You come in hopefully very close to the fixed exchange rate that's an equilibrium exchange rate that would clear the market, and off you go.
So on this issue, I mean, this is important one, because you need to start off with some sort of market determined initial exchange rate, which means you float for a period of time. But to get a proper exchange rate, then you need some form of capital mobility. Now, Lebanon doesn't have capital controls de jure, that has de facto capital controls, in the sense that because of the liquidity position of some banks and their exposure to government bonds, banks are simply not transferring money. There is no capital control law per se, but there isn't free capital mobility either. Do you need capital mobility, and how would you deal with is capital mobility a precondition for setting such an exchange rate, and maybe, or is the banking sector reform a precondition to somehow,
No, you're never going to be able to reform the banks unless the economy is stable and so forth. It's never going to happen. Period. And the bank deposits. You're right. The bank deposits are in effect frozen. That's a separable issue. It doesn't have anything to do with capital mobility. It's the bank deposits are frozen. So
they're frozen because again, we go back to the government, government's default.
They will under any regime, let me emphasize the word any, bank deposits will remain frozen and for the foreseeable future in Lebanon. End of story. And the question is, for those who have their bank deposits frozen, how will they do eventually? Eventually, they will get some money out. Now, one way that the adjustment takes place in a lot of countries is that you have a hyperinflation. Well, that takes care of it. You end up with nothing, basically. They unfreeze the bank accounts, of course, at the end of the thing. They reform the bank, but you have nothing. With a currency board, the prospect of getting a decent recovery of your deposits is going to be much, much higher than with any other kind of exchange rate regime. And one reason for that is this capital mobility. You start with the 30-day float, and of course the float is done in the context of having these in effect frozen bank deposits. I mean,
I must say something to you.
So you do that, Usama, but the point is that people are going to say, well, how can Professor Hanke be saying that I'll be having a better chance of getting my money back from the bank if you have a currency board rather than one of these other arrangements? And the reason for that is that you will get big capital inflows. You're talking about capital after the currency board goes in. Actually, by the way, the capital will start coming in the day one, not in day 30 when you actually install the currency board. The capital flows will start coming in on day one, just as they did in Bulgaria or any of these other places. When you announce it, the capital starts coming in. And why? Because there's a huge arbitrage profits to be made. So you'll have a lot of capital coming in right away, even under this floating arrangement. And of course, you would have free capital mobility under that arrangement. And that's why, by the way, once you start floating, I anticipate, I'm not predicting, but I would anticipate that the Lebanese pound would strengthen the equilibrium exchange rate in an expectation of a currency board will be stronger than it is right now.
That is, I mean, I think if this were done, say tomorrow, of course, there is, the market is also quite thin right now, so some modest transfers are causing big movements, and once you have more, the scope for more mobility, then you will have a more realistic exchange rate. The unfortunate thing, what's happened,
one thing on, by the way, it isn't that when you do this, you don't let the thing float for 30 days, and then you take the exchange rate on day 30 and you say, oh, that's the rate for the currency board to be fixed. No. You look at the pattern, what's been going on, the volumes.
Sure.
Obviously, a low volume day carries a lot less weight than a high volume day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And separately, you do some technical bench calculations on actually theoretically what the equilibrium fixed exchange rate should be, and you say, is the market lining up with these calculations? Is it in the zone of the calculations? And if it isn't, then you start scratching your head about that too. So it's not it's just not what we would call in basketball a slam dunk. It's a little more sophisticated than I'm really letting on, but it's all feasible. It's all doable. We did it in Bulgaria. We did it in Lithuania. We did it in Bosnia, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, go ahead.
What is unfortunate right now is unfortunately government inaction over the past months have meant that what we have is a set of policies that are, it's almost designed to create maximum economic damage. And the hyperinflationary episode that we're experiencing is ultimately one that, as you said, it could solve a lot of the problem of the deposits, but by that turning them to naught, and that ultimately pushes the burden of adjustment on the poorest and the middle class, right? So it's a social issue that you need a as rapid stabilization as possible. Would you share that view?
Yeah, I completely agree. Of course, in these hyperinflations, the ones who get clobbered the hardest are the poorest people, because to the extent they have anything, it's cash. And then beyond that, of course, you have people with deposits that are doing banking and banking deposits. Well, in Lebanon, they've been trapped already. They're trapped. And then you have rich Lebanese, of course. They're perfectly safe. They've got all their money offshore and protected, and they own real assets in Lebanon. The rich people own real assets. So real assets that appreciate. That's what I'm calculating.
Exactly.
How fast are the commodities going up in price? How fast are the services? And I said assets. There are no consumer price indices calculated any place in the world that calculate the value of assets, like houses, cars, things like that. Well, cars, they calculate at a transaction level, but they don't really do it like a balance sheet, what the value of a house is. So the hyperinflation is a massively regressive kind of thing. It just absolutely wipes the poor people out completely. And the inaction of the government, let me just say, since our last interview, the inaction of the government is, they've even been less active than before we were talking the first interview, Osama.
Indeed.
And as you say, they're dropping like flies. These guys are resigning. Everyone's resigning. So the credibility of the government actually much lower now than it was when we talked a month or so ago. Furthermore, I have watched these crises so carefully for so long that, believe me, what's going to happen if this keeps up, the pound will go to 10,000, and then it'll go to 15,000, and then it'll go to 20,000. So this is, I know almost precisely what's going to happen. It will be shocking how the collapse of the currency evolves if the government continues to fiddle while Beirut burns.
That's yeah. I mean that unfortunately is the reality. But I'm listening to you. I think you've almost anticipated my final question, which was really to say that wondering that you've dealt with a broad number of countries with various degrees of political dysfunction. But the Lebanese, I think a lot of Lebanese think that we're in a class of our own when it comes to government incompetence and political paralysis. Are they right?
No. This is a very characteristic thing, by the way. All these countries, that I don't know how many I've been involved with as officially and some even unofficially, but you go to them and they always say the same thing. Well, professor, always very respectful and so forth. And they, professor, you're telling us how things happened in 50 different countries, that you've had experience in and so forth, and all the history studying it and so forth and so on. But, the situation here is different. You just don't understand the local scene, professor. I mean, let me tell you, let's go over and have a coffee. This is going to take a half an hour or so. Let me educate you on what's really going on here. And then they give the local story, whatever it happens to be, which is always interesting and worth listening to, but it's kind of irrelevant. All these hyperinflations. You think you have functional governments hyperinflating you? I mean, you think the government was right-headed in Germany in 1923 when they hyperinflated? I mean, they had a lot of people, but it was basically dysfunctional. And most of these new hyperinflations, like Zimbabwe, has had 2 hyperinflations since 2007. It's just exactly like Lebanon. Exactly. I mean, there's just no difference. Venezuela has had now 2 episodes of hyperinflation in recent years, and the same kind of dysfunction, disorganization, nutty ideas floating around. It's a combination, Usam, I would say, of it's mainly seat of the pants policy. No one knows what's going on. They're very confused, and the political factions do make Lebanon somewhat unique. I mean, let's face it, the political system in Lebanon is unique. I'm at 30,000 feet. I'm certainly aware of it, and of course, as you know, Mrs. Hanke's French, so the French were part of setting the thing up. So I know how it's supposed to work when it works, but even that is a very complicated chessboard to be playing with.
It is indeed a complicated chessboard, which is again, I think, why an anchor like a currency board is why I personally am attracted to your thoughts and suggestions about this.
Well, again, let me close on a note. Let's put them put all those politicians in a straitjacket and stabilize and fix Lebanon. Step one, first point in the sequence, put out the raging inferno that is a currency crisis. Then you've got to deal with something very related to that affects everyone, and that is banking.
Exactly.
And that will be easier to solve with the currency board. In other words, right now you've got a currency board raging that's basically going to kill everything. By the way, if it keeps going, it will kill everything. At 15 or 20,000 to the dollar, I mean, people are going to be in such a panic, and the banking system in such shambles in Lebanon that you won't believe it. But let's fix that, and then we got to go to the banks. Now, the banks are in the intensive care unit, and with a currency board, basically we're going to be allowing them to go to their private rooms so they can be attended to by the doctors. We'll take them out of the intensive care, put them in a private room, and then we'll send the doctors in to figure out how we can fix them. And in the meantime, capital will be coming in. It'll be easier to fix them. And the prospect of people actually getting something of real value out of their bank deposit will grow. And who knows? They might end up getting all their money back. They might not get it tomorrow. They might have to wait a year or two, but they'll get it back.
Well, I think on the government debt side, there's a whole other dynamic that will imply, unfortunately, regulations can be an Achilles heel of any banking system, and I think in the case of Lebanon, of course, regulation, like in many other countries, is such that it is not possible for a bank to create a portfolio of assets that are sub-investment grade abroad. What this means for an emerging market is that you cannot create a diversified exposure to emerging market debt, for example, to replicate the type of returns that you have at home. And so you end up with a dynamic where people's money is in banks, but the banks end up buying the government bonds because they're treated from a regulatory perspective much better than buying foreign bonds, and you have an easy way for government to finance itself. But on the other hand, you have concentration of risks, right? And that is a tragedy that the Lebanese whose consequences are being felt by the population.
Well, yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's true, but it's not all. It's easier, by the way. This is the reason that I remain optimistic about some place like Lebanon, if they would adopt a currency board, because it allows you. You're in a deep hole. Think of yourself in a deep hole. If you're in a deep hole and you don't do the right thing first, you will remain in the deep hole. If you do the right thing first, namely a currency board, it's going to allow you to start digging your way out of the hole. And what I've done, looking at the history of currency boards, and they've been installed in wars and currency crises, banking crises, banking deposits frozen, every possible thing under the sun. The thing that's surprising is how fast they've been able to dig out of the hole. So all of these things that are weighing on Lebanon can be dealt with in a surprisingly fast way, actually. And one thing that could be very fast, by the way, is if the government would come up with a proposal for a currency board, and they would submit that to the IMF, because the IMF, that's exactly what we did in Bulgaria in early 1997. The IMF, as well as the World Bank, got behind it immediately, because they were smart enough to see, oh, I see, that the Bulgarian politicians are actually proposing something that would put them in a straitjacket. That's great. That's just what we want. It's 1,000% better than IMF conditionality, because IMF conditionality, it looks tough, so forth and so on, but it has no teeth. Conditionality has no teeth. That's why you get recidivism. That's why you have Pakistan back in for the 23rd time they've had a program, an IMF program in Pakistan. There are all kinds of conditions on Pakistan, but Pakistan looks the other way, and there's nothing really the IMF can do to enforce conditionality. But with a straitjacket and a currency board, that's it. They're in the straitjacket, whether they want to be or not. And that's the beauty of the whole thing. With regard to the IMF and getting the IMF moving, it's a simple proposal. It's a straightforward proposal. It's one the IMF has adopted before. And by the way, the managing director of the IMF happens to be a Bulgarian. So she knows very well she knows exactly how the thing works. So I would think that would be my approach and recommendation. It would get this thing moving immediately. It would stop all this drift, because without something concrete like a currency board, I really don't know when Lebanon will come up with a plan that they'll be able to propose that the IMF would accept. Honestly, this thing is going on for months now, months after month. They need to get moving with something specific.
Well, on the note of hoping that they move sooner rather than later, and we get some sort of positive surprise. On that note, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and want to thank you for taking the time, and I hope that we indeed get to meet up in Beirut in the not too distant future once we can travel again.
I certainly would look forward to the pleasure of that, because I do know the hospitality is absolutely first rate, and the Lebanese are very, very welcoming. So that is a major plus. In addition, the food is excellent.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And talk to you soon.
Thank you.